All right. As a second piece to our look at these mystery cults, which we began earlier with our look at the Eleusinian mysteries and the whole story of Demeter and Persephone and all of the secret initiatory rites, still very, very mysterious to this very day. I want to consider briefly some really intriguing archaeological evidence that also points to another kind of side to these mystery cults that centers around the god Dionysus. Now, of course, Dionysus we've mentioned a little bit along the way. Hopefully, you've read a bit about him by now. God of revel, god of nature, god of wine, kind of a god as pure nature, really, as we get in the Greek pantheon. Now, in terms of mystery cults, we'll be talking more about Dionysus in upcoming lectures. I'm going to have you read a play called The Bacchae by Euripides, which centers around the figure of Dionysus, and in particular, kind of his role as a kind of ecstatic mystery deity, and this is the role of Dionysus. Probably, in terms of mystery cults, the more famous persona of him. Again, there's, like with all mystery cults, there is a lot we simply don't know about the worship of Dionysus in this context, but there is decent evidence that there was a time, both amongst Greek and Roman antiquity, where Dionysus was a god that was worshipped by devotees, mostly women, which is also very kind of striking, in which they would go out into the hillsides and the mountainsides and whip themselves into a frenzy. Very likely with the help of wine, but dancing and singing and clashing cymbals, and they would the worship rite would culminate in a violent sacrifice of an animal, a young goat, say, and they would tear the poor animal apart, limb from limb. And again, the most visceral of these stories say that the worshippers would then eat the raw flesh and drink the kind of the still warm blood of the animal as a way of the animal. The idea is that the animal in that moment becomes the god. There are these stories in Dionysus's backstory, in which he was as a fetus, as an unborn being, was blown apart twice in some cases, and then, but he, of course, he ultimately does come to be born. So he's this god who's dismembered, destroyed, but comes back, and so the animal is kind of dismembered, destroyed, and then by eating the animal, you ingest the deity into yourself. So, like I said, that's the kind of the more famous, kind of more salacious notion of Dionysus as a mystery deity. And again, we'll be talking more about this soon when we encounter the play, the Bacchae. But what I want to do in this brief lecture is introduce you to some really intriguing evidence of the worship of Dionysus as a mystery deity that seems to take a very different take on him. At least as far as we can tell, that is the kind of the violent aspects of it, the dismemberment of the animal, which the Greeks called the sparagmos, is absent, but suggests another way, perhaps, of approaching this deity in a secret initiatory way. And this evidence comes from this this archaeological ruin of this magnificent villa in the city of Pompeii. Down here, so Pompeii down here on the big map here, down here in kind of southern boot of Italy, not far from Naples. Here's an inset of the bay here. Of course, this area, historically speaking, is most famous for the eruption of Vesuvius in August of the year 79 A.D. Vesuvius erupted. It probably more accurate to say it exploded and buried this area in lava and ash. Most famously, the town of Pompeii, which was discovered then hundreds of years later, or I should rediscovered hundreds of years later, and has since become one of the kind of the grand archaeological treasures in the world, and is probably the place that you can go to and best understand how ancient Romans lived their day-to-day life. Well, in and around Pompeii, archaeologists have found a number of these magnificent villas. And it becomes very clear that this area was a kind of a playground for the rich, where as the northern Italy would get a little cold in the wintertime, the very wealthy would go down south, where it was a bit more warmer, a little bit more temperate, more kind of classically Mediterranean, and they had these massive mansions down there. And I want to take a look at one of them today that is now known as I have up here, the Villa of the Mysteries, because of this extraordinary kind of quasi evidence about the worship of Dionysus as a mystery deity. Now here's a artist reconstruction of what the house may have looked at when it was fully intact here, and it was a sprawling place. Most even what we would call wealthy Romans. They did not have extravagant houses. They tend to be very small. Most Romans, because of the climate, as it is pretty temperate almost year round in Italy, you spent most of your time outside. Your house was not a place where you would necessarily spend a lot of your time of your day, but for the kind of the ultra rich, you did see things like this, kind of almost a little town unto itself. And we don't know again what family owned this villa. Again, there's lots of stuff that we wish we knew that could maybe fill in some of these gaps. But whoever owned this house was in the absolute upper tier of Roman wealth back in the first century AD. Now, we call it the Villa of the Mysteries. Here's kind of a bird's eye view floor plan of the mansion here, and it's called the Villa of the Mysteries because of this room here, numbered 5 here on our slide here. And what this room was, we think it was probably a dining room. I'll say more about that in a second, but we don't really. One of the difficulties is explaining why someone would have this type of artwork on their dining room. But it's really kind of a 3-sided room here. It opens onto this here porticus, this open air columned portico, and there's a kind of an open side to the room here. It's a rectangular room, and it's got a kind of a tiled mosaic floor. But what's most famous about it is there's this fresco. It's very difficult to photograph. I'll show you. I did the best I could. That wraps around, kind of starting here, kind of goes again from left to right, like you would read a book. Around. It seems to show kind of sequential scenes that take you from kind of one panel to the next that tell a story. Now, there's no text, there's no captions to tell us what's going on, and that's what again makes it more mysterious, maddening, or intriguing, depending on how you view it. But what it seems to show, we think, our best guess, it shows an initiation of a young woman into the mysteries of Dionysus. And that's what I want to kind of take you through today. Here's an outside of the villa. It's in pretty good shape, as a lot of the stuff in Pompeii is, buried by ash. I mean, there was lots of fire, lots of collapse to the buildings when they were recovered, and so there's been some restoration. But this is a villa that you can largely walk through today and experience it along the lines of what it would have been like nearly 2,000 years ago. All right, here's the room. Here's the dining room. We're looking from the open edge on the portico side, and you can see it really starts here, and these kind of painted pillars that you see along the way, we think, kind of divide the scene into these panels, almost like a comic strip that wraps around here, starts here, wraps around here, past and then beyond this window here, and ends up on this side of the room. So it tells a story. Now, there's still lots of mystery about kind of why it's in a dining room. What would have a visitor maybe coming over for dinner to this house, what would they have thought of this? Would they have inherently understood what was going on there? Again, it's, even though this is some of the best evidence that we have for the initiation into a mystery cult, it's still deeply mysterious. In some ways, it's almost not helpful because the room for speculation in this is so large. All right, so what I want to do here is I want to take you kind of panel by panel, and what I'm going to give you are what I take to be kind of the best hypotheses for what is going on here, all the while encouraging you to recognize that there's still so much unknown about this, that these are just our best guesses along the way. All right, now we think these paintings show is the initiation of this woman. And it's very likely that this was the woman of the lady of the house, what the Romans would have called the domina. And so she would have been married to the dominus, the lord or the master of the house. And it seems to show her initiation into the rite of Dionysus. Now, at the end of this, I'll speculate on why the lady of the house would have been initiated into the cult of Dionysus, and why it may have made sense to kind of advertise this in the house. But let's just go through the details, such as we can create them. So here we see the woman. She seems to be starting on her path to initiation. She's dressed in kind of the full, kind of layered garb of an upper class, wealthy Roman woman. You can see her head is covered, which was for the Romans you see, it's in lots of religions, the covering of one's head, particularly the head of women, is a signal that something sacred is happening. It's a sign of kind of religious humility. And so it's this, she kind of crosses this threshold. She's entering upon the stages of the rite. We have this naked young boy. He's reading something from a scroll. We can't read it. We don't know what he's reading. We have what's likely kind of an attendant of the cult, maybe a priestess of the cult. Here, she has kind of almost a motherly hand on the child's shoulder. She also has a scroll in her hand. We don't really know what's going on here. We do know that, again, in ancient imagery, particularly Roman imagery, naked children were often a signal of something divine happening. A single of, again, it was not meant to be salacious or sexual or pedophilic or anything like that. It was a signal that something divine. There's a kind of there's a purity about the naked child. There's an innocence that is kind of inherently divine. And then the woman you see here, we presume, is the same woman that you see here. But she now know what's happening. Her head is no longer covered. She's got ivy in her hair. She's starting to kind of lose parts of her elaborate dress, and she carries a platter which seem to be kind of simple, kind of bread cakes sprinkled with pine needles, and these are all symbols of Dionysus. And so the idea is, so why is she shedding her clothes? Well, meeting Dionysus, the god of pure nature, the idea seems to be you kind of lose all the trappings of civilization. This dress here marks her as a wealthy upper class Roman citizen with all of the trappings of Roman civilization. So here, to meet the god, you have to lose them, and by losing them, you're kind of losing yourself. So she starts to do that here. All right, the next panel, we see, again, we don't know a lot of what's going on here. Our initiate does not seem to be in this scene. We have other kind of female attendants of the cult, which seems to be fairly typical of the Dionysian cult. It was mainly, not exclusively, but mainly for and performed by women. Some have suggested that the woman here is kind of revealing something secret, like with Eleusis. Part of the initiation, we think, may have been kind of the viewing of secret objects. Maybe she's revealing them by lifting the veil here. This young woman here, note the ivy in her hair. She's pouring out perhaps a libation, a wine offering to the god. And then this figure here is a satyr. So one of these kind of half-human, more kind of goat-like figures that were often in the company of Dionysus. They're usually drunk and wild and running around and singing. They represent kind of that wild side to Dionysus. This is a satyr who's often given the name Silenus, and he's plucking a lyre, and he's leaning on this post, which many suggested that shows that he's drunk. Silenus was often depicted as being drunk. He's drunk the wine, he's filled with Dionysus, so to speak. So again, we're getting closer to kind of that wildness of nature, and we're also getting close to a place where the boundary between human and animal, civilization and nature, is starting to be blurred. Again, you're kind of leaving that world of boundaries and concrete definitions behind, and that's necessary to meet the deity. Now we get to the last panel on that left-hand wall as you're facing the fresco, and here we see a couple of figures. You can see here you can see it better. They're kind of pointy ears. This figure is there. These we call kind of satyrs or fauns. If you're familiar with the Narnia stories, Mr. Tumnus is this kind of figure, a resident of the forest, half animal, half human. This one's playing the pan pipes. The god Pan himself, of course, is indicative of that slipperiness, that boundarylessness of the woods. And you can see this fawn here is nursing a deer from her breast. And so again, the kind of that breakdown in category between animal and human, we're starting to lose ourselves, we're starting to lose those definitions. And then here we see our initiate again. And this is interesting. She seems to be kind of whirling around in what most people see on her face and in her gesture, a pose of fright or surprise or horror or at least trepidation. And she seems to be looking at the next wall. So the wall turns here, and she seems to be kind of looking at the next panel. And so whatever she sees there perhaps terrifies her. So what does she see? So the wall turns there. Now we're on kind of that far wall. And this is probably the panel on which the most scholarly ink has been spilled, and the debate has been heaviest. So this seems to be whatever's going on here signifies maybe the central part of the rite, the kind of the darkest part, the most terrifying part of the rite. And so what's going on here? Well, we have an older satyr here. Maybe this is Silenus again, and he's holding up this jug, and we have this young satyr here, either kind of peering into the jug or drinking from it, and then we have another young satyr or faun back here, who's holding up kind of this grotesque bug-eyed mask here. And again, there's been lots of scholarly disagreement about what's going on here. Some think that this young faun is drinking wine from a jug, which would be a reasonable expectation in a rite of Dionysus, but that doesn't explain kind of everything that's going on here. I'll share with you the explanation that I like best. Again, this is not my interpretation. The interpretation here is that the young faun is not drinking from the wine, but he's peering into it, and he sees the liquid, and the liquid acting as liquids do, as a mirror. And again, depending on how you read this, some have seen on kind of his wide eyes here, kind of again an expression of surprise, perhaps mirroring the woman's face over here. And what does he see there? So the idea is that he looks into the jug, and in that mirrored surface, he expects to see his own youthful face looking back at him. But what he sees instead, again, if you follow the line here, he sees a reflection of this face instead. It kind of lines up just like that. And so what does that mean? Well, the idea is that he sees into the liquid, expects to see his youthful face, but instead he sees kind of the wrinkled, balding, aged face of the satyr that he will become. That is to say, he's confronted with his own mortality. He has to come to terms that this is what he will become. And so stretch that out a little bit further, the idea that the woman here sees in this panel something that represents kind of her own confrontation with mortality. And lots of people think that that's exactly, of course, what was at the heart of these mystery cults, is that you would come to confront your own death, or you would reenact your death. You would face death in a way that the god or the goddess at the central part of the rite faced it. And it's only by getting beyond that you can be reborn. So perhaps what this would have been, again, to the educated viewer, they would have recognized this is the heart of the rite. This is where the darkest part of the ritual takes place. Again, it's all couched in imagery. It's all couched in symbolism. This likely does not really tell us exactly what the woman went through, but it symbolizes what she went through. Then we get to the central panel, which unfortunately is the one that's damaged the most. You can see that the fresco has been broken away here. But it clearly is the god himself. And that would make sense. This is at the dead center of the fresco. So if you're standing on that open part of the portico and looking straight on, you see the god. Again, the god seems to be drunk, and he's kind of collapsed on the lap of this woman that most people think, you see she's the top part of her body's gone. But most people think that this is his wife, Ariadne. And she's kind of comforting him or taking care of him. And so the idea that it doesn't really kind of show anything about the rite, but it's clearly Dionysus. You see his thyrsus here, his staff. You see the vine leaves in his hand. He's collapsed. He's drunken. But the idea is that right after the darkest part of the rite, here comes the god. The god has survived death. This is a god who has been destroyed twice and has been reborn twice. And so he's a god that can conquer death. That's the key element for the mystery cult. And so whatever he does here, he helps you pass whatever is going on here. And then the last scene on that far wall, we see our initiate again. Here, again, she's mourning in kind of a stage of undress. She's kind of stripped to the waist here. And there's an attendant here. She's a little damaged, but she's carrying, again, that platter with the cakes with the vine leaves. And there's some interesting things going on here. We have this female figure here with the wings. And most people think this is a kind of an avenging, kind of a demoness or a fury. And the idea is she's coming with her whip to attack. But at the last moment, she looks away and puts up her hand. She's been warded off. She's been turned away. And again, there's lots of disagreement about what exactly is going on here. But the explanation that makes best sense to me is that there's a long-standing belief. You find this in ancient and also contemporary religions, that kind of the moment of your conversion is often a moment where you are the most spiritually vulnerable. And especially in a case like this, is that whatever she went through, this exhausting, terrifying, psychologically draining rite, as she emerges from it on her knees, she's very, very vulnerable. And so she needs time to recover. And so the idea is that it's almost like these attacking furies smell blood. Here's a weak spirit that can come in and take advantage of. And so the woman, in her defense, she starts to reveal whatever is hidden underneath this cloth here. Now, again, like I said, there's disagreement exactly what this is, but I think the best explanation is, if you remember back in our lecture on Hermes, we talked about how phallic imagery of obscenity, particularly kind of the erect male genitalia in ancient belief. Again, this is just not the Greeks. You find this seriously around the world. The idea that that kind of symbol would have the effect of warding off dangerous spiritual influence. And to me, I think it's kind of obvious. So she's this whole kind of frozen panel is telling a story. So here comes the avenging demoness to take advantage of the spiritually, emotionally drained woman, and to protect herself, she reveals the phallic imagery, and that's what's successful in warding her off. So she uses that symbolism to protect herself in that moment. All right, then the wall turns. We're on our last wall, and here we see the initiate. Again, she's stripped to the waist, and she's exhausted. She collapses in the lap of this woman, who we assume to be a kind of an attendant of the cult, a priestess of the cult. This woman comes. Some people thought that this is the initiate again. It's hard to tell. It could be, but here she comes with the thyrsus, kind of the wand, the staff of Dionysius, and a cloak, perhaps. And then this woman is twirling around, clashing the castanets above her in the midst of a celebratory dance. You can see from the hair, it could be the initiate too, but the idea is that she's exhausted, but now she's being cared for. She's emerged. She's gone through the rite successfully, and now the time for celebration has begun. Now the next panel is it's a jolting change, and again, we're not exactly sure what's going on here. You can see it doesn't survive as well in terms of the painting as the other panels. But we see the woman here. Again, this seems to be our initiate, and now she's back in her civilized upper class dress. She has an attendant nearby, perhaps helping her. She's doing her hair, and we have a little Cupid here, a chubby little god of love here, and he's holding up a mirror so she can kind of watch herself prepare for something. Now, the best interpretation of this is as I take it, is what we're seeing is she's preparing for her wedding. She's still depicted as a very young woman, preparing for her wedding to the master of this house. And again, if this is a typical Roman practice, she would have been much, much younger than her husband. She probably would have been likely in her mid to late teens, and her husband would likely have been probably about 20 years older than she was. Such was the kind of the customs amongst upper class Romans. And so she's getting ready for her wedding here. And then we have in the next panel, which is really in many ways kind of the last substantive panel here. Here we see again what we take to be this is the lady of the house. Now you just have to take my word for it. The way that she's dressed, again, she has her head covered. She's she's reflecting on something sacred. The way that she's dressed now marks her as an older woman. She is the domina of the house, and she's been the domina of the house for quite some time. And she has kind of a wistful hand on her chin. She has her hand on her chin in a wistful kind of way, and she seems to be kind of looking back, as it were, at the whole experience. And you see her left hand is prominently displayed on the cushion of this elaborate couch that she's sitting on. And I don't know how well you can see this, but it seems to be kind of call attention to the fact of that ring on that again what we call the ring finger on her left hand. Again, the custom that we still have of wearing your engagement and your wedding ring on that finger of your left hand is one that in the Western world goes back to the Romans. And so the whole between this panel and this panel, there seems to become now an emphasis kind of away from the initiation of the cult and into kind of a focus on her being the married domina of this house. Now, what does that mean? Now, again, there's disagreement, but what we speculate, what we think, is that there were other places for these mystery cults in kind of the social construction of Roman society. So the idea here was that the woman didn't simply go out onto the hillsides and tear goats apart with her fellow young women as a way of kind of dealing with the existential questions of life and its meaning and death and resurrection, but rather the idea is that this whole rite was part and parcel of or at least a handmaiden to the wedding rite. And this idea that it wasn't that maybe the rite wasn't necessarily about kind of the finding spiritual resurrection on the other side of the meaninglessness of death. I mean, that could have been part of it too. But it was more about kind of dying to your old way of life and being born into a completely new circumstance. And that certainly, from what we know about, again, upper class society, for imagine what it would have been like for a young woman like this. She would have had very likely no say in who she was marrying. She would have been married off to a family to make, a political, likely business or both connections. She would have been maybe 15 years old, marrying a man who was in his mid-30s. I mean, imagine how absolutely uprooting that must have been. As a child probably in the mansion of her own immediate family, she probably grew up very isolated, very cut off from the world, didn't have a lot of experience in the world, and now suddenly you're being told you're going to be married off, and now you're going to become the domina. The mistress, someone who's going to run this massive household, run all of the servants and the slaves, basically kind of running a little town. And imagine that being taken away from your mother and father and your nannies and your servants and saying, put it over here, and you're playing this completely new role. It must have been absolutely kind of psychologically uprooting. So the theory is that a rite like this one, when you kind of die, you go through death, then you enter into a kind of resurrection. The idea was that this kind of spiritual experience could help pave the way for this new life. And so it wasn't not just about kind of facing actual death and getting actual resurrection beyond the grave, as we know that many mystery cults attended to. This was also about dying to that old self and being born into an absolute new situation. So all this is to suggest that these mystery cults weren't just simply about answering spiritual problems. They could have had a very deeply important social aspect to them as well, and these kinds of rites would have been integrated into a woman's life like this, and so it just give you a small taste. I mean, again, at the end of the day, there's so much that we simply do not know. But these small little pieces of intriguing evidence at least give us a peek into the larger array that these kinds of rites played in ancient society. There's one little panel that it seems almost have like a little kind of cute little light comic effect. Is that we have the little Cupid here, and he seems to be kind of mimicking her pose here. Perhaps it's kind of a reminder of that this arranged marriage blossomed into love, and this was a successful marriage. Maybe that was part of what's being advertised here. All right, that's enough of this. See you next time.